Thank you, organizers, for inviting me to help participate in this. So this afternoon, we have some sessions focusing on particular topics. The first one we have is going to be talking about open space, green space, and their connection to different aspects of health. The first speaker that we have lined up to talk about this is Debra Cohen from RAND, where she's a senior researcher who's kind of, I would say, the leading authority, or one of the leading authorities, on parks, physical activity, and they're also looking into how these spaces also are conducive or not conducive to social interaction. Deborah, thank you very
much. Thanks very much. Anyway, what I wanted to do today is tell you about the National Study of Neighborhood Parks. And this is the first national study like this, and I especially want to thank Dick Jackson for his advocacy, because I don't think without him, being relentlessly persistent about the importance of the built environment that this kind of study would ever have gotten funded. So the study was funded by NHLBI, and we did it in association with the City Parks Alliance and the Trust for Public Land. So you all know, the reason why, we are very much concerned about parks is one of the main problems is physical inactivity across the United States. And you all know it's a risk factor for many health problems, from heart disease to depression to premature death. So parks are really the solution. They are venues for physical activity. They have sports facilities, playgrounds, green space, walking paths, and they're part of the infrastructure of cities all over the country. In urban areas, between 50 to 70% of residents live within a walking distance of a neighborhood park. In some cities, it's way higher. Right now in San Francisco, 100% of the residents live within a 10-minute walk of a park. And there's a movement to increase the accessibility of parks and to create new ones. In LA, we have the 50 Parks initiative. So it's very well recognized, the importance. But what do we really know about how parks are used? There's been a lot of studies. Until this national study, most of the investigations of park use have been in local areas. And so the question is, are these findings generalizable? And so we wanted to investigate the conditions, characteristics, and the management of parks across the US, and to find out what are the factors that increase or decrease park use. So what we did is we had a sample of all the cities in the United States, and we did a stratified complex sampling design where we wanted to get a representation across the US, and also we limited it to cities with more than 100,000 population. Once we selected cities, so we had the north, the southeast, and the west, we also limited it to parks between 3 and 20 acres, because these are the size of parks that usually have sports facilities. And they had to be within the city boundaries and operated by the local Rec and Parks Department. They had to be unique public parks and not shared with schools, so that the park would not be open all day to the public. And we did not want to choose anything that was specialized, like Griffith Park Observatory or a boxing gym. And so there we had our sample. We also selected parks. We divided it by the city median poverty level. We selected half the parks above the poverty level and half the parks below, so we could really look at disparities in parks. So we did 2 waves of data collection. The first wave was in 2014, where we examined 174 parks in 25 cities. And then in 2016, we added 2 cities, Minneapolis and Portland, and we visited 193 parks. We collected the data only during the spring and the summer, and we actually hired data collectors in each of the cities. We brought them to a central location and trained them in how to do the data collection. We used SOPARK, the System for Observing Play and Recreation in Communities. And we, had them practice. We evaluated how well they were doing it. We made sure that they were going to be accurate before we certified them to go out and actually collect the data. In the last round, we also interviewed park users, of course only adults, and we also surveyed in both waves the management of the parks to find out what their routine rules and practices were. So these are the cities that were involved. LA was one of them, so was New York. These are, again, randomly selected. So we had a pretty good representation across the country. And you can see the strata that we had in the legend. So how did we actually collect the data? First, we mapped all the parks, and we divided them in what we call target areas. We numbered them sequentially, so it'd be easy to go through the park, starting at number 1, moving through. And we defined the target areas basically so we could see the entirety of the park, 100% within the park borders. And then we tried to make a target area so that it covered only a certain use. So a basketball court would be one target area, or a gym, or a baseball field. So we could see how those areas were being used. And when we counted people, we first counted by gender. We counted just the females, and then we counted the males. And when we counted them by their age group. Were they children, teens, adults, or seniors? We counted them by their race, ethnicity, and we counted them by their activity level. So were they sedentary, in moderate activity, or vigorous activity? And we counted them mainly as a snapshot. So at the very second that we scanning from left to right, what they were engaged in, that's what we recorded. And so when we went around, we also recorded characteristics of the target area, of the park. Were there supervised activities? Was there loose equipment? Was it an organized program? We also characterized the entire park. Was there graffiti? Was there litter? Were there people who looked threatening? Were there food vendors? We had a whole checklist of things that we did. Some of them we did every day, and some of the things that were immovable we just did once for the entire week that we were there. And we also did this several times a day, several days of the week. So we had previously done a validation study where we went to 10 parks in 5 cities, and we observed those parks for 2 weeks for 14 hours a day. So every hour, we're counting everybody in the park. And after we had all that data, we realized we don't need to count 96 hours a week. 12 hours a week is really sufficient to robustly estimate all of the characteristics of the users, as long as you include 2 weekdays and 1 weekend. So we ended up doing Tuesdays, Thursdays, Saturdays, and Sundays, and we covered different hours of the day on each of the days so that we had a real good sampling of the park use. Okay, so what facilities are in neighborhood parks across the nation? And the most common facility is a lawn. 97% of the parks had a lawn. Play area was the next most common, and followed by basketball court, baseball field. So you can see not every park has all the things that you might want to see in a park. So they're all different. And the other thing we wanted to find out is who's using the parks. And this was a little bit surprising to us, some of the findings. First of all, there are more males than females using parks. 57% of the people we counted were male. And that gender disparity was actually surprisingly stronger in children and teens than adults and seniors. So among children, 60% of the children were male. Among teenagers, 65% of the teens in the parks were male. So females are very much underrepresented in the age groups you wouldn't expect necessarily. Adults, males, females were almost equal, and seniors were also pretty close. Still more male seniors than female. Okay, but then also the age group disparities were also striking. So children and teens overall are overrepresented compared to their prevalence in the population. So like twice as many children in parks as you'd see in the local neighborhood. 38% of park users children versus 20% of the population. Teens 13% of park users versus they're only 7% of the population. Adults underrepresented, 44% of park users versus them being 55% of the population. And the biggest disparity was with seniors. Only 4% of the park users we observed we could classify as being over the age of 60 when they're 18% of the population. So that's a huge issue that I know we're going to hear more about later today. Okay, so we also had gender disparities in what people were doing. So if you just look at sports, is what we think is going to happen a lot in these larger neighborhood parks. Very rarely do we see females engaging in sports. We're talking about soccer, baseball, softball, basketball, and it's mostly males. And males are generally staying active through the lifespan, but not so females. We almost never saw female adults, never saw any female seniors playing any sports. So what are the factors that we found that were associated with park use? First of all, size is important. The larger the park, the more people we would see. So for every additional acre of a park, we saw 9% more park users. Population density, very important. So for every 10,000 more people that lived within a mile radius of the park, there were 13% more park users. Poverty was important. And what we saw was that the high poverty area parks are used less than the low poverty area parks. So that for every 10% reduction in poverty level, there's 14% more users. Sort of the opposite of what we might have intuitively thought. Facilities are important, so that the more facilities, the more users. So that for every 4 additional facilities, 14% more users, like 3.5% per facility you get. But the big things were supervised activities. So for every additional supervised activity, almost 50% more park users. And then the other thing, on-site marketing, this was whether there were banners or posters or flyers in the park, advertising activities. If it had any kind of advertising, 62% more users in the park compared to parks that lacked any banners or posters or flyers. So it's the demand goods in parks are really important. The things, the social things that make people want to interact or be with other people seemed like they were more responsible for attracting more users. So what about the disparities by SES? As I mentioned, the high poverty area parks are used less. They tended to be a little bit smaller. So even accounting for size, but when you look at the facilities in the parks, they actually have the same numbers of facilities. The biggest discrepancy was in the number of supervised activities. They had less than half the number of supervised activities as that were available in higher income area parks. They had somewhat more litter, but we didn't see any difference in things like homeless people or loose dogs. And across the country, almost all the parks had all usable facilities. I mean, they're in actually pretty good condition, the parks. So the barriers are probably less to do with infrastructure than to do with other factors. So the other thing we looked at and we noticed was the importance of walking loops. So a walking loop in a park is a pathway you can just walk around without being interrupted by traffic. And we found that parks that had those walking loops tended to be much busier. They had 80% more users on average, and they had twice as many seniors in those parks compared to parks that lacked walking loops. And we had much higher MVPA levels, that's moderate to vigorous physical activity. They were 90% higher, and not only because people were walking on the walking loop, people were more active in other areas around those parks as well. And parks with loops were less likely to be empty. Actually, when we go to the parks, especially the mornings and the weekdays, most of the parks were empty. I mean, they are very severely underutilized. You can think about it, our average park was 8.8 acres, And on average, we saw only 20 people in the park at any given hour. So, and that's an average, right? So some of the times it's empty, sometimes it could be double, triple, quadruple. These are, you know, vast spaces that are severely underutilized. So what were the top facilities that generated moderate to vigorous physical activity, which is the level of intensity of activity that's important for fitness and health? Walking path was number one. It generated the most hours of MVPA, but it was only in 29% of the parks. So most of our parks lack this most important feature. Gyms came in second, but they're very rare in neighborhood parks. Pools were third. You know, if you're in a pool, you're automatically engaging in moderate to vigorous physical activity, just trying to stay afloat. So skate parks, also a lot of activity. They mostly serve males. Okay, so let me move ahead. The parks are actually being pretty well cared for. A lot of them had capital investments. 32% had changes, and only 10% of the parks actually changed their footprint over time. But many parks lack programming. 19% of cities had no neighborhood programming at all in their parks. A lot of them rely on nonprofits, but even some of the cities don't even have nonprofits that help out. So let's look at the features and amenities. But basically, it's more facilities, more amenities, there's more use. But the things that's notable, if a park is next to a highway, there were fewer users. And parks with drinking fountain and bathrooms had like double the numbers of users. So those are important. And you know, we surveyed people and we asked them how long they stayed, and we found that, you know, the more facilities, the longer people stayed. If there was a picnic area, they stayed longer. Bleachers, you know, baseball fields, those are, you know, facilities where people come and sit and stay for a while. Okay, and we looked at playgrounds, and we found that that of all of the activity, 25% of the use is in the playground areas. And when we asked people why do they go, half of the time they said it's to bring my kid to the park. Slides and ladders are important, swings, but some of these other elements, crawling tubes, balance, shade, they're less common. And then this is as a bell curve for the number of elements in the playgrounds in the country. And we found that each additional element type was associated with 12% more users. Spinners were favored parks had spinners, 66% more users, and splash pads were really popular, 83% more users. We found, in contrast to the whole park, the playground had more females than males, especially it's the women that are doing the supervision of the children more than the males are. Is that a surprise, anyone? Okay, so if you're comparing high and low income neighborhoods, they had similar types and numbers of elements. We had no difference in the, you know, the use of them. There were actually more splash pads in lower income area parks. But within cities, we really didn't see differences. But we did see that for every 10% increase in household poverty, there were 20% fewer users of the playground, you know, accounting for their population density. So this is the people we ended up interviewing in the parks, a little more females than males. I guess they're easier to approach. Mostly adults, 26 to 39, usually the parents of younger children. And most people live within a mile of the park. About a third will travel more than a mile to get to the park. And if the park is in a higher income neighborhood, people travel further to get there. We asked them to rate the parks, and there was strikingly similar impressions of parks. If you just divide the parks by whether they're high, above or below the median poverty level, there was slightly more people thinking the parks were more excellent or welcoming if they were in lower poverty neighborhoods. If we tease it apart more, there's a greater difference between the bottom tertile and the top tertile. We found that if a park had graffiti, it had a lower perception of excellence. If it had more female users, it was perceived as nicer. Bulletin boards, people liked them better. Accessible restrooms, they thought they were more welcoming and interesting, and trash cans. That was really important. If the park didn't have a trash can, it was like really weighted poorly. We had similar duration of stay, a similar frequency of visits, but the main difference was the perception of safety. So the parks in the low-income neighborhoods were perceived as less safe, 20% versus 5% in the, 20% in the high poverty neighborhoods versus 5% in the low poverty neighborhoods. So the question we had, is that enough to explain the discrepancies in the use? And we thought, we were wondering, well, why aren't the neighborhoods, parks in the low income areas used more? Because they thought, well, maybe people are working too hard, or they're traveling too far back and forth. But it turns out, we started looking at the American Time Use Survey. It turns out that low income groups actually have more leisure time than higher income groups. And you can see here the men below 185% of poverty have 6.5 hours on average of daily free time versus 5.7 for wealthier men. And the wealthiest women have the least free time of all. And you can see that red bar is how much they spend of that time in physical activity. So wealthier men spend more time in physical activity, and low-income women spend the least time in physical activity. And what the difference is that most people are spending the majority of their free time in screen time. So they're watching television. And you can see the physical activity is really, the second graph there is very low, and the green on the bottom is how much time they're spending of it outdoors. Okay, and just the last thing I want to say, we asked people, were they willing to spend more in taxes to get better parks? And a little more than a third said they weren't, but about 63% said they'd spend more money. So just to wrap it up, we have a lot of disparities in park use. They're being maintained and renovated, and the facilities and amenities contribute. More elements get more use. We need to do more to address disparities. And I just wanted to mention one interesting thing is we went back to the cities after we did the measurements to report their results. And when we talked to Westminster, Colorado, one of the cities, we noticed they had a huge bump increase in their park use. And we asked them, well, what happened? And they have a full-time social media person. They also have 5% of their property taxes dedicated to parks. So they have a lot of money. But they started a rumor that there was a monster in Stanley Lake. And they had started seeing sightings of this monster in the parks. And they found these eggs.
Fake news.
The monster's eggs, and sometimes they would find the rainbow poo of the monster. And they actually, every week, they plant 200 eggs in the parks and along the trails. And they've been getting like 3 million hits on their social media. Wow. And they're just through the roof with their use of their parks. And I think that's really somehow an inspiration that we can really activate parks and get more people outside. If we've got, if we're competing with, electronic media and entertainment, we have something really exciting for people when they get there. Thank you very much.